Well, this finally brings us to what is probably the most famous passage in all of Plato's writings, which is called the Allegory of the Cave. It's a story that is supposed to describe how true education works. It's supposed to describe the kind of education that the guardians will undergo, for instance, on their way to coming to know the forms and coming to know the form of the good. Okay, so there might be various kinds of what's sometimes called education, but on Plato's view, it's not true education unless it does this thing that he's going to describe with the allegory of the cave. So he says, imagine that there are some prisoners who are actually strapped in a cave. They're strapped down in a way so that they can only look ahead towards a cave wall. So the only thing they see their entire lives is the wall of this cave. And there are some images playing on the cave, basically shadows cast on the walls of the cave. And this is all that these people know their entire lives. They can't even turn their heads to look at one another. They just see the images on the cave wall. Now, the shadows on the cave wall are coming to them from some objects that are being carried along a wall behind them, kind of like puppeteers would, like shadow puppeteers would have some puppets. There's a fire behind the puppets, which is casting light on the cave wall, and as these objects are carried in front of the fire by the people who walk along the wall, the images end up on the cave wall, and people see those, again, shadows of those objects on the cave wall. So now Socrates asks, he's talking with Glaucon, and he asks Glaucon, some questions about this. He says, imagine that someone got free of this constrained condition and managed to start to move their way out. So the other part of the cave I haven't mentioned, sorry, is that there is actually an entrance to the cave. There's a way to get out of the cave entirely. It involves walking, basically turning around and walking past that wall with all the figures and so on, and walking all the way out into the sunlight. And once one gets out into the sunlight, then it's, in terms of the cave analogy, it's the world we know as the kind of the everyday world of reality outside of a cave. So there are real plants and animals and water, and there's the sun, which is shedding light on everything and allowing everything to be seen. So whereas the people in the cave have only seen, the only light that they've seen has come from this fire behind them, and they've only seen it indirectly. They've seen it, just reflected on the walls of the cave. Once they leave the cave, they see the true source of light, which is the sun. Okay, so true education, according to Plato, is basically getting out of the cave. It's somehow getting free of these constraints, leaving the world of just the images on the cave wall, turning around, walking out of the cave, past the statues that are being carried along the wall, and all the way out of the cave entirely. And coming to know things out in the world, the plants and animals, trees, streams, and the sun. Okay. Now, this is an analogy, an allegory, because remember, Plato doesn't think that the plants and trees and animals that we see, the sensible realm, is the most real thing. He thinks, in fact, those things are more like the images on the cave wall. The whole point of the analogy is that the true reality, according to him, is not the reality we see and interact with on an everyday basis. It's not the reality of the sensible world. The true reality is the reality of the intelligible world. So what we need to do in order to get true education, or in order to really know things, is to kind of break free of the constraints of knowing or thinking we know things just in terms of sensation. We need to break free of what we experience through sensation and focus on what we can know through intellection, or through reflection, or through thinking. And so that's basically the model. The cave wall corresponds to the sensible world. The cave and everything that's happening in the cave corresponds to the sensible world, whereas uh, the world outside of the cave corresponds to the intelligible realm or the intelligible world. Okay. And the sun corresponds to the form of the good. So once we get outside, once our eyes adjust, we become more and more able to look up to what is the source of all of the light and reality that we see, which is the sun. There are parts where Socrates says, look, isn't the sun actually the source of, in a way, the existence of all the things we see, since it provides energy that is taken up, eaten by the plants, and then the plants are eaten by the animals. So he actually makes a little argument like that the sun is the origin even of the existence of the things we see on Earth. I don't think it would apply to the existence of all things we see on Earth, like mountains, for instance, but it applies for like the living things we see on Earth. So good enough. You might say the gravitational pull of the sun is pretty important for the Earth being the way that it is. But again, these are sort of beside the point. It's really supposed to be just an analogy to help us grasp what would knowledge of the form of the good be. Now, Socrates also imagines a scenario in this little dialogue. He says, imagine that someone broke free of their chains and started to turn around towards the sunlight. Wouldn't it be hard for them at first to understand what they were seeing? At first, it would be very confusing that one was no longer looking at the cave wall, right? At first, it would be like, what is this? This is completely different. And it might be scary, and people might even be tempted to sort of not turn around, to go back to the cave wall because it's too weird, it's too different, it seems like something's wrong, right? But if they somehow manage to keep walking, then eventually they would see the people carrying the objects along the wall, and they might be able to figure out that everything that they'd seen up to that point in their life was actually just an illusion, just an image cast on the wall by these objects, and that the objects carried along the wall were more real than the images on the cave wall. Okay, but if they kept walking, if they walked past those images and past the fire and walked out to the entrance of the cave, again, it would be hard for their eyes to adjust, but eventually they would become capable of seeing things outside of the cave. And once they left the cave, they wouldn't want to return, because why would they want to go back to a life of ignorance when now they have knowledge, when they have experienced the much larger, wider world outside the cave? Why would they ever want to go back to their constrained existence? In fact, they would think that there was almost nothing worse in the entire world than being forced to go back and stare just at the cave wall. Okay, so this is supposed to be an analogy to what it's like for people who do acquire true education, who do grasp the forms or grasp wisdom in the sense in which it's given by philosophy. They don't want to go back to doing the mundane sort of ignorant things that most people would be doing, or most people are doing according to Plato. Okay, most people are really wrapped up in the sensible world. It's really important, this like particular thing that happens or this particular thing they see. You think about things that people see on the news or things that you know, kind of clickbait stuff. You could think about like you know, various hobbies, all kinds of stuff that people can be really interested in comparison with true knowledge, deep knowledge of things, which is what Plato is describing here as knowledge of the forms and knowledge of the form of the good. All of those other concerns seem kind of trivial. So I don't know exactly how Socrates would apply, or Plato would apply, this model in the contemporary world, but it does seem like he has a fairly low estimation for a whole lot of what people would consider worth knowing and investing time in ancient Athens. For instance, young people who are studying for a career in politics and want to learn how to persuade other people to go along with their proposals, they would probably fit best in this allegory as people who are just staring at the cave wall. They are consumed with images, illusions. They want to learn how to use illusions to convince other people to believe illusory stuff. You think about advertising, you think about politics in the contemporary world. So much of what people are consumed, sales, so much of what people are concerned with is actually really not about the truth. It's about just kind of using different kinds of ways of presenting things or images to uh, create effects of other images. Even money. I mean, you think about money. What is money besides, in a way, just a kind of image that's effective, that people trust and believe in? So much of what we engage with in the kind of everyday world, it would count as illusory and as a kind of shadows on a cave wall, according to Plato's allegory. But true knowledge is what we have when we get out of all of that rat race, all of that kind of illusory stuff, and start to move out of the cave or get out of the cave and see things for what they really are, which is knowing, which is knowing the like true and deep patterns of things, the forms. And then finally, Socrates presents one more little imaginary scenario. He says, imagine that somebody escaped and then went out to the real world. They made their way out of the cave, and they decided to go back into the cave and try to rescue people. They tried to go back into the cave and free other people and help them to get outside, to help them to leave this uh, fettered life, this life of being forced to just look at the images on the cave wall, and tried to help them get out of the cave and see the truth. Wouldn't the people who were sitting looking at the shadows resent that person? Wouldn't they be angry at them? Wouldn't they try to stop them? And if they could, wouldn't they actually kill that person? Because they might think that person who's trying to save them, is trying to rescue them from their illusory existence, that person is threatening everything that they know. That person is threatening their whole reality. And so that person who's trying to actually get them to the truth and free them from the cave, it is perceived by the people in the cave as like the most dangerous person. And in fact, it's pretty clear that what Plato has in mind here is his own teacher's death, Socrates' death at the hands of the Athenians. He's saying, look, Socrates is kind of that person who escaped from the cave and saw the truth for what it was, and then went back to the cave and tried to save people. And the people resented him for that, and they killed him. As I mentioned, this is a very famous passage, and it's been represented in many different ways, for instance, here on this slide and here on this slide. So there are a lot of different ways of thinking about this, or slightly different ways of thinking about this, but the basic structure of the cave allegory is very clear.